So we have the pleasure and honor of having very distinguished speakers today, and actually representing the whole spectrum of the debt restructuring ecosystem. I mean, we have the scholars, Brad and Sean. We have representative of the bilateral creditors with William. We have Masitala representing the debtor countries, Mark with the IMF, and Michel with the private creditors. So thank you very much all for being here today. What I suggest is that we kick off the panel with a presentation of the paper of Brad and Sean's paper. Maybe let's take 12 to 15 minutes to start, and then we'll give the floor to the other speakers. Thank you.
Thank you, Hamouda, for chairing this, and thanks for everybody for joining the panel, and also for those who came. I'm going to provide a brief overview of the proposal that was just published at the Peterson Institute, and Brad will illustrate how it applies in the country context with some examples. I think it's important that whenever you make a proposal for reform, it's incumbent to basically define what problem you're trying to fix, and also indicate why it's sufficiently important to mobilize the political will to fix it. So basically, the paper articulates the problem as one of delay, undue delay in the restructuring process, and by extension, the unpredictability in the process. And we point out that this is not just in the common framework, but also in the framework that applies to emerging market debt. And we argue that the problem is not just for all stakeholders, but in particular for the sovereign. Why is that? Because once the process is initiated, to the extent to which there's an undue delay, it deepens economic scarring, both of, undermining foreign direct investment, undermining domestic confidence, and also, further extending the period for reaccessing capital markets. But perhaps, and this is what distinguishes it from earlier issues that we've had, in particular, to the extent to which the delay involves the restructuring of official claims, which is what's happening often, it basically delays IMF support. And that delay can actually undermine the adjustment process, obviously. So what is, the next question is, what is the cause of the delay? Well, there is no question that changes in the composition of official creditors is a major factor, particularly with the emergence of China as the single largest official creditor. And one could argue that this is let's call it a growing pain problem, that it's going to take time for China to normalize and internalize the type of debt relief that Paris Club creditors have grown used to over a longer period of time. And I'm not saying that that's not the case, that this is not a factor. I think it is. What we're arguing is that there's something else at play, which is that there are intercreditor equity issues that are exacerbated by the way in which the existing process is organized. Okay? So, I mean, we've seen, for example, that Paris Club creditors are unwilling to move without China. But China will often be unwilling to move without the private creditors. I think, as my friend Lee Buchheit said, we're dealing with a three-dimensional chess paralysis here. And our view is that this intercreditor equity problem is exacerbated by what we refer to as the sequential approach, which really has been in place since 1989 as a result of the introduction of the IMF's lending into arrears policy. where official creditors are expected to move first and private creditors follow. But of course, first movers never have the assurance that there's actually going to be adequate burden sharing. Because of this, I think the economists would say at the time, inconsistency problem. Now, in theory, this should be addressed by comparability of treatment. So the debtor commits that it will not provide private creditors with terms that are preferable to those that were offered to the official creditors. But as we all know, and I've been attending some of the panels so far, there are real issues about comparability treatment. First of all, how has it been applied in the past? There are different views as to whether or not it's been achieved. How is it measured? What indicators should be used? And how should it be enforced? All right? And so we think that the uncertainty in this space, when applied in a sequential context, does give rise to delay and unpredictability, and I think Brad is going to illustrate how this played out in the case of Zambia, which is one of the case studies that we have. Now, this is not the first time, of course, that the international community has had to address intercreditor equity issues. We had this issue, collective action problems, with private creditors. And reforms were introduced to address that issue, including collective action clauses. In some respects, the lending into arrears policy that applied to private creditors was also a response to this. The difficulty here, of course, is that we're dealing with collective action problems amongst the IMF's own shareholders. And these problems are exacerbated by geopolitical tensions. So our proposal is quite simple. We don't think it's actually quite radical, which is to move from a sequential approach to one where negotiations proceed in parallel and ultimately lead to a simultaneous decision-making process. So what does simultaneous decision-making process mean? It means that when one creditor group decides to accept the offer, it knows exactly what is being offered to the other. And you could augment that by what we refer to as a contingency mechanism, where the effectiveness of that acceptance is contingent upon the acceptance by the other group. Now, again, there's no originality here. This is a basic feature of corporate insolvency law. And if you talk to any corporate insolvency lawyers, they say it's critical in getting creditors to do a deal because they have some assurance on burden sharing when they do it. Now, it doesn't mean that every creditor group gets the same deal. As Brad has explained at length, both over the last couple of days, but also in his writings, private creditors and official creditors have different preferences. But instead of trying to come up with a single formula as to how these preferences can be accommodated in all cases, a one-size-fits-all, this would be now a subject of negotiation on a case-by-case basis. And in terms of enforcement, it's relatively straightforward. If one group thought that the terms being offered by the other were not fair, it would not accept its own. So sort of it's self-enforcing. Equity is self-enforcing. Now, it's simple, but in order for it to work, there are a couple things that need to be addressed. First of all, you can't have a parallel process, let alone a simultaneous decision-making process, unless all the creditors have adequate information. I think this is something that's been acknowledged, for example, in the co-chair's progress report. And this involves really two types. First of all, private creditors need to have early access to the DSA and the economic parameters that underpin it, but they also need to have access to what terms have been offered or are being offered to official creditors. Well, the good news is, and I'm really glad Mark is here, is that the IMF has introduced reforms over the last couple of years that basically should help make that happen. The guidance note illustrates that basically private creditors can get, subject to confidentiality constraints, information on the DSA and the parameters at an early stage in the process, even earlier than the staff level agreement in some circumstances. And also, the fund revised its lending into arrears policy to require now that essentially private creditors should be able to see what other creditors are getting on a comprehensive basis. So the second issue, which in some respects is the most fundamental one, is, isn't there a risk with this approach that we will be giving private creditors a degree of leverage in the process that will actually end up slowing the process down if they drag their feet? After all, the sequential approach was introduced in 1989 precisely because the private sector was dragging its feet. So the paper has two responses to that. 2024 is not 1989. Private creditors, by virtue of secondary market trading and mark-to-market, most private creditors have an interest in a restructuring process that is rapid, because excessive delays basically undermine the value of secondary market trading. And also they have an interest in achieving a debt restructuring that actually restores sustainability. If it doesn't, it's not going, the secondary market values are going to reflect. But the second point I want to make, and I'm hoping that this will assuage some concerns, including by the Paris Club, is we're proposing that this simultaneous decision framework would not be mandatory. In those circumstances where the official sector believes that the private sector is dragging its feet, it could go ahead and proceed on a sequential approach. But in those cases where intercreditor equity issues are central to the restructuring, where the claims are such that it's central, this approach would be used. Now, you can't rule out the process, conversely, that private creditors might want to move first too. They may believe that notwithstanding the intercreditor equity issues, they want to move quickly. So this creates optionality. Final point I want to make is, just to put this in broader perspective, the sovereign debt restructuring process is the only process, debt restructuring process, which is not guided by a public law. All right? It's all done by norms and conventions. And you can debate the advantages or disadvantages of that, but one of the advantages of this approach is that you can make adjustments relatively easily. You can change norms without going to legislation. What we're suggesting is that an adjustment is overdue. And we're also suggesting, and this is in the paper, that this adjustment is exactly aligned with the evolution of policies in other spaces, including IMF policies on information sharing and on lending in arrears. If all creditors are getting information now, why not have a parallel process? Thank you.
Thank you, Sean. Brad, 5 to 6 minutes on the Zambia case.
Well, thank you very much. It's a unique honor to co-write a paper with Sean Hagan. I think when he first met me, I was, to use a phrase that many here will understand, the Theomai of the US Treasury. And it was something of a shock for Sean to be asked to work with me in the development of the sovereign debt restructuring mechanism. But we got over our age differences, found consensus.
Thanks, Brad.
Not just once, but twice.
Yes.
Zambia is an interesting case and an important case, despite being a small case, because it illustrates almost all of the issues that have to be addressed. The creditor composition was such that nearly every important issue was at play. But the most central issue that was at play was that China was big. It was an absolute majority. XM alone was an absolute majority of the official sector claims. And it is widely thought that the Chinese commercial claims, once CDB and ICBC were moved into the commercial bucket, were roughly of the same magnitude as the bonds. So this was a case where there was no equitable solution that did not involve not just one group of Chinese creditors, but two. Moreover, it was a case where even in the upside scenario, some NPV debt relief was required. And in the base case, a reasonably significant amount of NPV debt reduction was required. As a result, the process, as we all know, played out very slowly. 4 years from default to completion, a very significant lag between default and the IMF program, and then very significant lags between the IMF program and the initiation of negotiation with the private bondholders. And then on top of that, a lag associated with bringing the private deal into conformity with the Paris Club's assessment of comparability. I think at each stage in that process, it became clear that creditors, well, each group of creditors actually cared greatly about knowing broadly what other groups of creditors wanted. The first lag had something to do with some things to do with China that no process can solve. China initially did not want to do a stock treatment. They just wanted to push everything off to the end of the program period. If the biggest creditor doesn't want to play ball, the only equilibrium outcome is an extended default. But after China accepted the basic principle, provided financing assurances, it became pretty clear that China XM could not, in some deep sense, for political reasons inside China, ultimately accept an agreement that was going to be obviously worse than the agreement that was made with private bonds. It could be different, it just couldn't be obviously worse. That took some time to resolve. It ultimately led to the introduction of the contingency mechanism in the official debt deal. Once that agreement had been structured, you could argue agreement with the bondholders should have come quickly because the contingency mechanism had already been agreed up front in the official restructuring. But there wasn't clarity in the first instance about what comparability of treatment meant, which meant that it was going to end up being, in effect, litigated through a variety of offers. And there wasn't specifically, according to many bondholders, transparency about the level of NPV debt reduction that was expected given the official deal for the private deal. And in that context, unsurprisingly, private creditors initially put forward a deal which matched the official sector on NPV relief, but provided almost all the near-term cash flow to one group of private creditors. The Paris Club, I think, official creditor group, correctly said that didn't meet notions of comparability. The initial proposal also didn't meet the IMF's parameters. Bondholders came back with a proposal that narrowly met the IMF's parameters, but didn't really address the concerns of the official creditors committee. That too was rejected. And there was a great deal of anger. In some sense, because private creditors said, we don't know what is being asked of us. How much NPV reduction is needed in order for this all to be consistent with program parameters? How could a parallel process have helped make this better? It wouldn't solve the problem created when the biggest creditor is unwilling to do stock reduction and the IMF believes stock reduction is necessary. That is an unsolvable problem by process. It would have allowed the negotiations with the private creditors to have started much earlier, and for the issues that ultimately became central to finalizing the deal to become apparent much earlier. It would have made it quite possible for Chinese creditors to know how the official sector deal, or private creditors to know how the official sector deal impacted them, but also for the Chinese commercial creditors and other commercial creditors who are not bonds to know how the combination of the official sector deal and the private sector bond deal impacted them. There is a unknown question that's still unresolved about how CDB wants to be effectively represented in a process and not left at the end of the table. So I think in this case, and I think similar observations can be made about other cases, actually having information about the content of the debtor's proposals to other creditor groups at an earlier stage in the process would facilitate rapid decision-making.
Thanks very much, Brad. Let's move quick to Masitala and have quick reaction, notably based on the Zambia experience that you lived through.
Thank you, Hamouda. I think I'll start with a common saying. I'm speaking purely from the debtor's point of view, the country that faced the problems of debt. There's a common saying which goes, when two elephants are fighting, it's the grass that suffers. And that's exactly what Zambia went through. Most of the issues that came to play while we were restructuring our debt, as a country, as a debtor country, we didn't know how to address them, to be honest. And these are issues that sprung up from processes that were beyond our control as the debtor country, but we had to play along. One thing that we decided from the onset was to ensure that we were going to play our part as the debtor country, and playing our part meant that we were going to be as transparent as possible, which is a very necessary requirement in this process, and we decided we're going to do that right from the beginning. So we were very transparent in terms of the information that was required from the IMF's perspective, but as well as from the creditor's perspective. I just wanted to highlight some of the milestone dates, and probably from there we can see where the delay was. So in November 2020, the Common Framework was born. So the G20 Paris Club signed up to the Common Framework, endorsed the Common Framework as a solution to try and help debtor countries come out of the debt problem. Zambia applied to this Common Framework 2 months later, February 2021. So as you can see, we didn't really waste any time, because we knew that we needed to address these issues as quickly as possible. Staff level agreement with the IMF. So at that time, we also applied for an ECF IMF program. The staff level agreement was reached in December 2021, the same year as we applied for the Common Framework. 16th June 2022, the OCC was formed. So as you know, as you are aware, before a country starts engaging its creditors with regards to debt treatment under the Common Framework, the IMF program has to be in place. And for the IMF program to be in place and approved by the board, financing assurances are needed from the bilateral creditors. So that's where the challenge was, actually. The financing assurances have to be provided before the ECF can be approved. And the ECF is critical for the creditors to be assured that the country will make reforms that are needed to ensure long-term debt sustainability. So that kind of situation actually posed a bit of a challenge, because now in the OCC you had creditors that were non-Paris Club. So they were not so familiar with the processes of the Paris Club, notably China. And for Zambia, China was the biggest creditor in the bilateral group. So we had these challenges right from the start. And if you notice the month that the financing assurances were provided in July 2022, 2 months later, actually a month later, the program was approved. So we had the financing assurances. At this point, we were so relaxed, so confident that the process would move without any problems. Little did we know that that was the start of a long and very, very difficult process for both the creditors as well as for us. So the financing assurances are provided, the program is approved, debt treatment couldn't be agreed immediately with the official bilateral creditors. Why was that the case? I think that's the point that the paper brings out. Issues of intercreditor equity, even in the OCC. So these intercreditor equity issues is just not between the bilateral creditors and the commercial creditor, but even within the OCC, we did realize that there were some issues right there that needed to be addressed. And we had this challenge as well, because it took a year for actually a deal to be agreed with. And during that time, I think as a country, we could sense the fact that there was a lot of consensus that had to be reached within the bilateral group. I think Mr. William Roos here will talk more about it. I don't want to speak for him. But as a debtor country, we noticed that there was a lot of discussions, consensus that needed to be made within the bilateral group. We also noted that the biggest bilateral creditor, China, had a lot of questions at a technical level, and for you to agree a debt treatment, there are a lot of technical discussions that have to be had for you to engage and agree on a debt treatment. We noted that. We spent countless of hours in the night sometimes just to go through all those technical issues. We had our advisors on board. We had the secretariat, the Paris Club secretariat, who were very supportive. They were on board. We had the IMF on board just to ensure that everyone was on the same page. So it wasn't an easy process for us to finally reach a debt treatment agreement with the OCC. That wasn't the end of the problem, because as Sean mentions, it was a sequential approach. So we needed to agree first, so that the parameters of comparability of treatment could now be taken to the private creditors. In this particular case, the bondholders were a bit more proactive than the other group of private creditors who were still standing on the fence and were not so organized. So we had the bondholders already coordinated, ad hoc committee already formed, and just sitting, waiting to get feedback from the OCC in terms of what was agreed, how it would be applied, and all that. The other group of private creditors, both Chinese and other private creditors, were a bit reluctant. First of all, coordination issues in that space, it's not something that we could even start talking about. It was a challenge as well to just coordinate. So we'd engage at a bilateral level with the other private creditors. And the questions that were coming from there was how much are the bondholders giving up, okay? How much is China giving up? So we were in the middle of, as I mentioned, the two elephants were there fighting, and we're right there in the middle without any real answers, so to speak, because we didn't know how the process should play out. So comparability of treatment in that particular case became a challenge. Again, when we finally reached some kind of consensus in terms of agreeing the deal with the bondholders, which, as you know, was rejected in November by both the IMF and the OCC. With the IMF, it didn't meet the DSA parameters, but with the OCC, the issue of comparability of treatment came in. Later on, we again spent hours and hours trying to ensure that it meets both the OCC and the IMF's expectations. We managed to do that with the IMF, finally, after a lot of hours of trying to revise the proposal. It did meet the IMF expectations, but it didn't meet the comparability of the OCC expectations. At that point, we were asking ourselves, what is this comparability of treatment? Yeah, so what do we have to do for us to be comparable? And there were a lot of questions. To be honest, even at a technical level, we had no idea. It was something where we are learning. You see, it's like you're doing research, and at the same time, you're trying to apply that research to the real situation you're in. It was a very difficult process. But later on, after a lot of engagements, finally, we managed to have something that was deemed comparable. And we managed to have that debt treatment agreement with the bondholders. What is it that we are trying to say as a debtor country? First of all, the common framework in itself had or has good intentions that you cannot take away. Why do we say that? In the beginning, when we saw that we were really having challenges with our debt, we tried at bilateral level to start engaging. We tested the waters. It didn't work out. We looked at our portfolio, our loan book. We had so many creditors. We have so many creditors. And it's a situation where you say, where do we start from? Okay, so we tried with the big ones. Okay, we tried with those that we thought were close to us, would really listen to us, but it didn't work out. So we were trying to say, oh, look for a framework that would bring everyone together. When the common framework was announced, we said, why not? And when we actually realized that the G20, China being part of the G20, and most of these bilateral creditors being either in the Paris Club or the G20, all had committed to provide debt treatment to debtor countries, I think for us, as Sean mentions, that was a breakthrough for us, because this is what we needed. We needed to start from somewhere. So I must mention that the intentions were good. The delays, just like the common framework itself mentions, sometimes you have to take a case-by-case approach, country by country. The circumstances differ. The delays definitely are there. What are the causes of the delays? In my opinion, and that's my opinion, there's fundamental issues beyond the procedures, the processes. We can improve the procedures, and as Sean mentions, we can move from being sequential to going to being parallel, ensure that everyone gets the information at the same time. But there are fundamental issues that we really need to deal with. Fundamental in what way? We need to ensure there's consensus on the big issues, okay? There needs to be consensus on the big issues. For example, how do you define comparability of treatment? That's one thing that we need to agree to. So it's a fundamental issues that are really a big problem with a common framework. You have a framework where the private creditors are not obligated, and that's something that we noticed. They are not obligated to be part of it. The common framework is for the bilateral creditors. They signed up to it, they committed to it. But the private creditors are not obligated, and we got that a lot in the beginning. So you mentioned to them, no, it has to be comparable under the common framework. We are restructuring under the common framework. And they ask you, what is the common framework? We don't know what the common framework is. Even if we know what the common framework is, we didn't sign up to it. So there are such kind of fundamental issues that we need to deal with, obviously. And for us, I think, Hamouda is looking at me, so I think I would want to end there, and just to end by mentioning that when we discuss the merits and demerits of the common framework, I think you need to live through the process for you to understand how this framework should work. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Masitala. Let's now turn to William and probably have the bilateral creditors perspective. I mean, we've learned a lot from Sean, Brad, and the unique takeaways from Masitala. It would be great to hear your views.
Thank you. It's a great pleasure for me to be with all of you. Indeed, it's a good moment to take stock of what we have done, what was good, what can be improved. I'm so happy that you can talk about that in a quiet manner because it's behind you. And first, just as an introduction, common framework, it's just a coordination mechanism. So you could say, why is it so complicated? Because we put around the same table different countries with different geopolitical perspectives, etc. And we ask them to be focused on a technical issue. So it takes time. But, and you have also within the countries different institutions. Even for France, we have to deal with direct French treasury loans. We have to deal with loans provided by our French Development Bank, and we have to deal with commercial loans covered by an export credit agency guarantee. And so, and we have also different type of loans. You have concessional loans and you have non-concessional loans within the OCC. So, yes, it's difficult, but we put around the table many different loans instruments. So it's not the same as bondholders, and there is only one thing. You understand that it's quite, it explains why there is a value regarding this coordination mechanism, and it is in fact the history of the Paris Club, to understand that we need to coordinate in order to solve the burden sharing issue between us, and we need also to be coordinated, to be honest with you, to have a leverage, and to give this leverage for the benefit of the bondholder, to have a leverage towards creditors which could not be so happy to restructure as much as it is needed. So this is for the introduction. Then my first point is, your paper is great. It comes at the right moment. We need to take stock of what we have done. We need to have a step back and to look with an independent eyes. And so we are happy that you provide this paper, which is very constructive, because you don't propose to change everything. You just look at what exists and how it can be improved. My second point is, and it is mentioned in your paper, in your presentation, we have delivered. It takes too much time. It was painful for Zambia. We fully recognize that. It was also, and I recognize that, painful for the bondholders, painful for the financial advisors of Zambia. It's painful for many people. So we have to improve, but we delivered. Zambia had access to the IMF financing. Zambia had an agreement with all the official creditors, and then we managed to increase the effort done by bondholders for the benefit of Zambia. And at the end, I think we have something which is well balanced. It's not finished, because you have other institutions with whom you have to negotiate, but we have delivered, and we are also making progress, because the lessons learned from Zambia, we are taking them on board to do better for Ghana, and we have reduced by 50% the time we take to provide to have the agreement in principle. For example, if we compare Ghana and Zambia. At the same time, as you said, there are things which really need to be shortened. We need less time. It's very important to have less time to form the creditor committee, and for that, it's just a political commitment. I agree with you, it's not normal to wait 6 months just to have the formation of the creditor committee. I think that the delay was due to the fact that it was the first time. Perhaps also there was some attempts for some official creditors to see whether some other roads could be possible. But I really think that this time for the formation of the creditor committee has to be reduced. Second element is to understand that we are not just talking about rescheduling and PV neutral debt treatment. It takes also time to convince all the official creditors that we are talking about a stock treatment. So we really have a very deep NPV reduction. We are talking about a 40% NPV reduction. So it took time to understand that it's not a two-step approach. We just provide the reprofiling and PV neutral, and we will see 2 years later what's happening. Third point is, you are right that we should not work purely in a sequencing mode. And I think that we have understood that progressively. And I think in the case of Zambia, we did that in a way because we engaged with the private creditor, that we took their idea of looking at a trigger for an upside scenario linked with the debt carrying capacity, and it helped a lot to have the same trigger. And it works only if we have a discussion in parallel. In the case of Ghana, it's what we do. We engage with the advisors of the private creditors, with the private creditors themselves, and I agree with you that it has to be done also with an information sharing mechanism, because and we did that. IMF has made progress on that side. We also make progress on that side. And in the case of Zambia, when we had the agreement in principle, we also provided to Ghana an information paper explaining what were our assumptions regarding the NPV reduction, debt service reduction, etc., from the private creditors. My fourth point is that it is for us very important not to give a veto to the other private creditors. First, because we have many private creditors. You have, yes, a big group of bondholders, but you have also many different commercial banks, etc., etc. So it's not possible to do that. And we had this discussion in the case of Zambia regarding, do we need, with all the official creditors, do we need to have a condition precedent for the activation of our MOU, waiting for Zambia to have agreements with all the private creditors? It was impossible. It would have been impossible for Zambia to have that. And so we convinced the official creditor that the comparability of treatment clause helped us to move forward, because it's not only, just imagine that it's perfectly parallel, coordinated between official creditors and bondholders. Yes, but you have commercial banks. So do we have to also to wait for commercial banks? And a debtor country cannot negotiate in parallel with dozens of different lenders. So it's very important, first, to give us the possibility to do that, and we have it today, we need to keep it, and also to be very clear that why we can move, because we have this comparability of treatment clause, and we are able to enforce it. And I think the Zambian case showed that we can take the responsibility, we can take the critics, and we can assume that. And I think it's very important. I also think that it's very important to let space for the debtor country and the financial advisors of debtor country to define the negotiation strategy. They could think that parallel track, it's the best way. And I agree with you, most of the time it should be. But sometimes, because they understand that there are some difficulties with some private creditors, perhaps they think, for them, I prefer to have first a deal with official creditors, a deal with bondholders, and then I will go to them and say, you don't have the choice, because I have the comparability of treatment. So we need to give them some space. To conclude, as I said, it's the right moment. At the G20 level, we are working on lessons learned, and I hope that we will be able to have a consensus on it. We will use your paper, and we try to improve what we have done. There is something which cannot be mentioned, which cannot be put in a G20 document. It's the coordination within a country. It could be the case of China. It is clearly the case of China. It could be the case of other countries. It's much better if around the table of the official creditor committee, you have all the public institutions in a way involved. And so for that, you need a mechanism with a representative of the country being able to talk about not only French Development Bank, but also loans covered by our export credit agencies and the French Treasury loans. And so for that, it's not only a question of organization, it means that we need to bear the loss. It's the case in France, and it has many consequences. It means that because we know that when there is a restructuring, we will pay as French Treasury, then we are able, in a preemptive manner, to give guidelines to the French Development Bank, to our export credit agencies, to avoid providing a loan when there is a risk of debt distress. So it's a big mechanism. I don't say that we have the right one, perfect one in France, but I really think that it's part of the issue to create that. We will have, it's great, congratulations for this 3-day conference. You will have the 26th of June, the Paris Forum, and I hope that many of you could attend. My last point is, it's a difficult world at geopolitical level. We have been able at this stage, regarding international debt, to have a multilateral platform which works, not perfectly, but which works. And I really thank all the official creditors, including China, because we have taken a lot of time to work with them, and I am convinced that they are committed to do it. All the other official creditors, private creditors, etc. I think we have been able to deliver, not perfectly, but we will improve.
Thank you very much, William. So Michel, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Hamouda. It's really a privilege to be here and to be on this panel. I was at a similar conference a few months ago in the UK, and the issues, the debate, the objective was very similar, but there was a larger representation of the private sector. And by the private sector, at that time, what was represented was bondholders. We are one part of the private sector. There is obviously, as part of private creditors, commercial banks, but a lot of other companies, mostly trading commodities that will have a lot of exposure to the countries that we've been discussing. So I will encourage to have more private sector representation. As you heard so far, the bondholders do not seem to be the issue. We tend to be quite proactive, and our interests are aligned. Our investors will do well if developing countries do well. So the interest is really there. The interest is to move fast, to have solutions, sometimes creative, but generally we are quite conservative. I see the paper from Brad and Sean as the necessary bridge between the thinking of the private sector and the public sector to try to make frameworks that are very useful, more efficient, and lead to more speedy resolution. So my perspective as an investor in emerging markets, we are long-term investors. I've been doing that for more than 20 years. Personally, specialize in frontier countries, so that's a big part of Africa, Central America, but I invest from Poland to Zambia. We are glad to see that things are progressing, but we like to see things progressing faster. What are the principles that guide us as bondholders? There's many, and they seem to be aligned with the principles of the Paris Club. I heard William on many of the roundtable of the G20 GSDR initiative, but as well the paper from Sean and Brad. So I would say the first thing is, if one recognizes the growing complexity of creditors of emerging market countries, there is a need for coordination to make sure that the information sharing is done in a timely manner. We have a fiduciary duty to our clients, which means that we need to minimize impairments at the same principle that will be guiding any public or private creditor. We as well seek to avoid unnecessary delay. And there's two types of delay. A country in distress situation does not necessarily lead to a default situation. So having information sharing and consultation at the early stage can avoid a situation of default. But when the situation of default happens, it's important to resolve it as quickly as possible. So a predictable and efficient process is a benefit for emerging market country and for emerging market debt as an asset class. This is a benefit for private investors in general. And we need as well, because we have secondary market trading, to minimize the length of restriction. So if we're in a situation where we need to wait for information, we need to wait for information sharing from the IMF, from the World Bank, from the official creditor, we will have to take a pause in negotiation. That is a necessity, otherwise we cannot fulfill our commitment to our investors. So that's part of the technicality that usually is not well understood, that private sector bondholders sometimes have to wait and have been waiting for months and months for the required information to be able to proceed. So for us, as highlighted in the paper, the publication of the components of the DSA as early as possible to the private sector is key. One of the consequences of the lending into arrears policy applied only to private sector is the incentive to restructure quickly for a country is less so than otherwise would be the case if it was applied to both public and private sector. So I'm regularly being asked why it's taking some time. This is one of the reasons. It's not just coordination, but it's not just having all the bilateral creditors at the sitting table, and there it's really about having China at the discussion table rather than other official creditors. So it's important. Comparability of treatment is essential for us as well. We always have the question of too much or too little, because at the end of the day, what you want to have is debt sustainability after a restructuring. That means that you need transparency from all the type of creditors. And we need to assess that the debt relief we provide as bondholder does not subsidize other creditors and other private creditors, notably, because we're only one part of the private creditors. Achieving debt sustainability post-restructuring is the most important thing that we care as long-term asset owners. As I mentioned at the beginning, we will do well, our clients will do well if the countries do well. So for that, it's not about how much debt relief, nominal stock debt relief and cash flow relief, but it's how much effort is done from the debtor countries to put in place the right policies to ensure that there is a necessary adjustment not to fall into the debt trap again. And I think that's part of the debate that should be featured a bit more going forward. So it's very important to have a sovereign committing to credible policy adjustments as part of the framework and the process, but on the ongoing adjustment after the restructuring. A few things that we think are very important to consider for the road ahead is one is non-financial clauses. We consider that they should become a standard of debt restructuring and possibly future issuance for low and middle income countries. From our perspective, that will make the asset class stronger and that will lower ultimately the borrowing cost for developing countries. And the second part is we hear a lot about state contingent instruments. Our perspective is we are fixed income investors, so we need instruments that are simple and that deliver fixed income. So it's always a consideration, but our investor will ask the question, should I invest in USD bills? Should I invest in leveraged finance in Europe? Or should I lend money to Ghana and Zambia? This is important to consider that they have the option and they need the clarity of whether or not they're making the right choice to invest. Ultimately, this is our investors that is guiding our decision making.
Thanks a lot, Michel. Maybe, Mark, to you now, and maybe you could tell us a little bit on how this proposal aligns with the debt policy reforms that the IMF is working on. Sorry. Maybe you could tell us on how this proposal fits within the debt policy reforms that you are working on at the IMF right now. Thank you.
Thank you, Hamouda. And thank you to the organizers and to Sean and Brad for inviting me to participate in this panel. I speak last, so I'll try to be short. I'll try not to repeat too many things. Okay. So, first of all, I want to remark that the landscape has been shifting, as several speakers have noted, in a direction that makes proposals like this more feasible. We've seen that both with the efforts of the GSDR, where if you read the co-chair's summary in April, there is an aspiration expressed there to do a better job in sharing information that would support comparability of treatment assessments. There is an acknowledgement there that that there was a possibility to do sequencing in different ways, and that really depended on the debtor. Now, from the fund's perspective, and I would echo William here, you know, we have to leave room for the debtor and the advisors to choose the right strategy in the case. And we don't impose a particular strategy. All the fund is after is that we have a sufficient restructuring in the sense of restoring debt sustainability and being consistent with program parameters, and a timely restructuring. That's very important because restructurings that are lengthy, as several speakers have mentioned, have severe costs for for the debtor country in question. So proposals like this that could, in principle, improve the timeliness of restructurings are very welcome, and they do have a role. Now, the question is, how can we, the fund, better support this? Now, through our policies, we actually do already have support for processes of this nature. For a long time, we have shared information with official creditors early on, recognizing that we need strong assurances from them. And as Sean mentioned, our lending into arrears policies encourage good faith, and of course that involves information sharing at an early stage. And 2 years ago, we extended this good faith requirement to pre-default contexts. So we're well covered in terms of our policies for information sharing to all creditors. Now, the question is, do our practices support this? And here we've been eager to improve them. I think, as Sean mentioned, we issued a guidance note last year that was very forward-leaning in the area of information sharing, essentially encouraging our staff to share all information as soon as it becomes available, and discussing modalities to get our board imprimatur for this information. And then just this April past, 2 months ago, we had our board approved debt policy reforms. One of the effects of these debt policy reforms is that we should be able to go to programs much faster. We've been taking a good 5 to 6 months from SLA, even in the improved version of the restructuring process over the last year. We've still been taking a good 5 to 6 months to go to programs. We think with these reforms, we'll get it down to the standard 1 to 2 months. And that would be a very large innovation. Now, that's important because when we have our board approve a program, we publish the staff report. And the staff report includes all the macro tables, the DSA, all the explanations for our macro framework, the letter of intent, the authorities' commitments, etc. All of the information gets put out into the public domain. So that's actually quite an important innovation and an important support for a proposal like this one. And the third thing I want to mention is we're not done. We're going to be publishing a sovereign debt handbook, which is the guidance on the implementation of our policies a little later this year. And we will lay out in great detail how our staff should live up to the reforms. That guidance will embed the earlier guidance on information sharing, but it's going to go beyond that. It will cover things such as how the staff can, in a forward-leading way, support processes to assess comparability of treatment. So we have we've done a number of things, and we have some things on track to actually further improve the situation. I mean, we think the information sharing issue is largely mitigated, and we think policies like this could play a role. But I do want to, or proposals like this could play a role, but I do want to make a couple of comments more generally about this. There's been a lot of attention from earlier speakers to the fact that countries may not select such a sequencing because of specific issues with private creditors and concerns about delay. I also want to flip the script too and warn that there are some countries that may not choose it because they would rather negotiate first with official creditors, recognizing that in some cases, these creditors, these official creditors, have really important diplomatic, trade, financial, and other leverage with these countries. So ensuring that for a debtor country, ensuring that relationship is maintained is in many cases going to be more important than trying to satisfy the amorphous private sector creditor group that may not be the same 10 years later, while that official creditor will still be there. So there's two sides to this coin, and it may be that countries choose different processes depending on the balance of these factors. The other thing I want to add a little perspective to is reasons for delay in the process. And we've had a recognition here that, and I think it's entirely right, the processes are only going to move as fast as the slowest creditor, right? So there is a big role here for improvements in internal processes within creditors, and we've seen that happening. actually over the last year to China's great credit. They're a new creditor. They've made a huge effort to improve, and they are becoming faster. So I want to recognize their efforts there. And like the message from the Paris Club, I want to add that we feel we've worked very well with the Chinese authorities over the last 2 years to improve these situations. The second point I want to make is there's another type of information that perhaps is missing that is contributing to problems with efficiency. And it's information about the norms and conventions of the restructuring processes. The GSTR is in a way trying to handle this, right? Trying to discuss issues like comparability of treatment, like perimeter issues. You know, what do you do with state enterprises? What do you do with domestic debt? What do you do with cutoff dates? From the IMF side, there's also some missing information. And that's basically what the role of the fund is in restructuring processes. Now, in historical perspective, right, we've gone through a period from 2000 to 2015 where the focus was on HIPC, and HIPC was a fairly simple, straightforward process with a set of steps that everybody understood. Now we've moved to a much messier process that has less defined rules and stages, and they need to be defined a little bit better. There's been a lot of progress on this. There's more to come. But even on our side within the IMF, there's not a full understanding of what the role of the fund is in restructuring. So we're going to take care of that. Part of our sovereign debt handbook will be a section on the role of the IMF in restructuring processes. We want to put that out there so everybody understands our playbook, how we go about setting debt targets, how we go about evaluating compliance with debt targets, how we support comparability of treatment discussions, how we support evaluation of targets, how we set conditionality on restructuring processes, etc. That is missing from the public sphere right now, and the availability of that we think would actually help solve some of the problems with delays. If you don't understand the process, of course the process is going to be elongated and messy. If everybody understood the process a little bit better, it would go faster. So GSDR, Sovereign Debt Handbook from the fund, hopefully we can take care of that element, that dimension of it, the norms and conventions. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Mark. Before opening up to the floor, thank you very much, Mark. Before opening up to the floor, I will ask Anna, who's right in front of me, to probably provide us with her takeaways of this conversation. We heard different perspectives from different players, and it would be good to have your views on the paper and the comments on the paper.
So thank you so much, and congratulations on putting out the paper. It is a terrific, I think, description of the state of the world with some valuable prescriptions. But I think as this panel illustrates very richly, where we could use a lot more work is in the analysis of the problem. And what I mean by that is we have heard the problem defined variously as delay, as China, as coordination, sequencing. And again, I think this is an understatement and in a way, a very antique way of looking at the landscape that you have painted. The deeper problem, I think, is the breakdown of the categories in which we operate, right? So you heard this from Michel, where, you know, private sector, what is the private sector? There are 5 different private sectors, probably 55, right? We heard this, that the official sector is not a single official sector, and William's point about, you know, the many different Frances that are represented is extremely important, because this tells us, so what's really new, right? France has been many Frances for a very long time, as has Germany, and I think up until recently, we could treat France as if it were France, right? But with the geopolitical fragmentation and with the rising role of creditors, that are not necessarily invested in the legacy institutions. The question of negotiation. And so, look, you could define public as taxpayer funded. You could define commercial as commercial terms for the debtor. You could define these things 50 ways to Sunday. And in this context, sequencing does create arbitrage opportunities, right? So rather than having sequencing and cross-conditionality as a disciplining device, it becomes an arbitrage opportunity. And I think that that is a much deeper problem than what we have, I think, identified so far. After all, there's nothing preventing any group of creditors from holding out until the others go forward, right? What's wrong is that this is just a much messier landscape. The other problem that I think Masitala raised reminded me of, the very first academic panel I was ever on was called The Grass Under the Global Elephant. And so I guess our hosts have a saying, the more things change, the more they stay the same. The debtor is responsible for creditor coordination in the current architecture, right? It is the debtor that must seek comparable treatment and explain what comparable treatment is to all the creditors who neither knew nor cared until recently, and maybe still don't. And this is particularly problematic in a world where the IMF is either nominally uninvolved or nominally arm's length or practically irrelevant. What we do about that, I think, is a much harder problem than what we've dealt with so far. So how should we, and the irony again, the debtor has all the burden but very little agency, which is a very odd combination. What can we do? I think, look, a more explicit muscular role for the IMF, which exceeds the word salad situation from April, although that's highly welcome. A more robust expression and more sort of clearer constraints. Certainly information disclosure is a very good idea, but I'm not sure it's sufficient. Contractual changes, great, but not everybody has contracts, and not everybody's contracts are connected with other people's contracts. So what is left? There is national legislation, which I think could make sense under some circumstances, particularly if it's coordinated across jurisdictions, and then norms, right? And norms is kind of the category under which these proposals fit. I do think that a handbook is a terrific idea for norm development. I think it's a leap forward that is much greater than is recognized. I keep harping on, excuse me, and I'll continue to harp on, the Common Framework needs a website. Y'all already put out press releases. Why do it on the Paris Club website if you say you're not Paris Club? GSDR could do more, including ex post analysis, right? I mean, so William, I love we've reduced the time by 50%, but when the N is 3, it's a little bit of an awkward math situation. Like, yes, but we don't really have a statistical sample. So having GSDR put out somewhat narrative, however general you want, readings of why this last restructuring was comparable or not, or just really not evaluate but describe, would be terrific. So all this to say, this is a terrific panel. I'm grateful for this opportunity. I'm delighted it's at DebtCon, and I think we have a ton more work to do. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. Thanks a lot, Anna. So I suggest we open to the floor, maybe pick 3 questions, and then have Brad and Sean react on them.
Hi, my name is Mark Boland. I'm a sovereign debt researcher analyst at Red Intelligence in London.